About 40% of us will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in our lifetime. And when you hear a number like that, it is easy to feel like it is mostly down to genetics and bad luck, things that are outside of your control. And there is some truth to that. You cannot change the genes you were born with. But here is what the research actually shows. Large-scale studies from the World Cancer Research Fund and the American Institute for Cancer Research have consistently estimated that somewhere between 30 and 50% of all cancers are preventable through lifestyle and dietary choices alone. That number is not small. That number is enormous. And it means that the food you put on your plate every single day is either quietly creating the conditions that cancer cells need to take hold and grow, or it is making those conditions much harder for them to sustain. The food you eat is not a minor factor. It is one of the most powerful levers you have, and that is what I want to walk through today. Not the scary headlines you have already heard, but the specific everyday foods that most people do not realize are shaping their internal environment in ways that matter. We are going to go through the science of how these foods influence cancer risk, and more importantly, I'm going to show you exactly what to do about it. Because the goal here is not fear. The goal is clarity and action. Part 1. Before we get into specific foods, we need to understand what cancer cells actually need to survive and grow. Because when you understand that, the food choices become obvious rather than confusing. Cancer is not just a genetic disease. It is also a metabolic disease and an inflammatory disease. And what that means is that cancer cells have a very specific set of requirements that are different from normal cells. Normal cells are adaptable. They can switch between fuel sources depending on what is available. Cancer cells cannot do that as easily. They have a distinct weakness in understanding that weakness is where the power lies. Cancer cells are much more demanding. They rely heavily on glucose for energy. This is called the Warburg effect, named after the scientist who first observed it, and it is one of the most well-established findings in cancer metabolism research. Cancer cells consume glucose at a much higher rate than normal cells. They basically ferment it instead of burning it efficiently, which means they need a constant supply. So, high blood sugar and high insulin levels create an environment where cancer cells have abundant fuel. But it is not just about fuel. Cancer cells also need signals to grow. And one of the most powerful growth signals in the body is a hormone called insulin-like growth factor 1. Or IGF-1. When your insulin levels are chronically elevated, which happens when you eat a diet high in refined carbohydrates and sugar, your body produces more IGF-1. And IGF-1 essentially tells cells to grow and divide. That is a good signal when you are healing an injury or building muscle. It is a dangerous signal when there are abnormal cells present that should not be growing and dividing at all. The third thing cancer cells need is inflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation weakens your immune system and breaks down the barriers that normally contain abnormal cells. Inflammation creates a kind of open door for cancer cells to establish themselves and spread. And the fourth thing they need is a blood supply. Tumors cannot grow beyond a certain size without building new blood vessels to feed themselves, a process called angiogenesis. So when you look at cancer through this lens, it becomes clear that certain foods are not directly causing cancer in the way that a toxin or a carcinogen might. They are creating the conditions that allow cancer to thrive. They are supplying fuel, turning on growth signals, driving inflammation, and feeding the blood supply. And the most concerning part is that many of these foods are not things you would think to avoid. They are everyday foods that most people eat without a second thought. Part 2. Let us start with the most obvious one first, because the data here is overwhelming, and it still does not get the attention it deserves. Sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, fruit drinks, sweetened teas, energy drinks. And I'm going to be specific here because this matters. The problem with liquid sugar is not just that it contains sugar. The problem is how fast it enters your system and how dramatically it spikes your blood sugar and insulin. When you eat a piece of fruit, the sugar is bound up with fiber, which slows down absorption and blunts the blood sugar response. But when you drink a soda or a fruit juice, there is no fiber to slow it down. The sugar hits your bloodstream almost instantly. Your pancreas has to release a large amount of insulin to deal with that sudden flood of glucose. And that spike in insulin, repeated day after day, drives insulin resistance and elevated IGF-1 levels. And as we just covered, IGF-1 is a potent growth signal for cancer cells. A meta-analysis published in the journal Nutrients in 2022 looked at dozens of studies and found that higher consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages was associated with a significantly increased risk of several types of cancer, including breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and liver cancer. And this was after controlling for obesity, meaning the risk was not just because people who drink soda tend to be heavier. The sugar itself was an independent risk factor. Now here's the part that catches most people off guard. Fruit juice is not exempt from this. A glass of orange juice has roughly the same amount of sugar as a can of soda, and it hits your bloodstream almost as quickly. The fiber has been stripped out during juicing. So if you're drinking a glass of orange juice every morning because you think it is healthy, it is worth understanding that you are giving your body a rapid sugar spike first thing in the day. The better choice is to eat the whole fruit. You get the fiber, the vitamins, and none of the metabolic spike. It is a simple swap that makes a real difference. Part 3. Now I want to talk about red meat, and I want to be careful here because this topic generates a lot of strong opinions and the science is more nuanced than most headlines suggest. The World Health Organization classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen in 2015, which is the same category as tobacco and asbestos. And that sounds terrifying. But what that classification actually means is that there is strong evidence that processed meat causes cancer, not that it is as dangerous as smoking. The risk from smoking is enormous. The risk from processed meat is much smaller, but it is real, and it is consistent across multiple large studies. Processed meats are things like bacon, sausage, ham, hot dogs, salami, and deli meats. These meats are preserved by smoking, curing, or salting, and they contain chemical compounds called N-nitroso compounds that can damage DNA in the cells lining the colon. The evidence is strongest for colorectal cancer. A meta-analysis from the International Agency for Research on Cancer found that each 50-gram portion of processed meat consumed daily increased the risk of colorectal cancer by about 18%. 50 grams is roughly 2 slices of bacon or 1 sausage. So if you eat processed meat every day, the risk adds up over time. But here is where the nuance comes in. Unprocessed red meat, meaning fresh beef, lamb, or pork that has not been cured or smoked, is classified as a Group 2A carcinogen, which means it is probably carcinogenic to humans. The evidence is less strong than for processed meat, but there is still a consistent association, particularly with colorectal cancer. However, and this is important, the way you cook red meat matters enormously. When red meat is cooked at high temperatures, especially by grilling, pan frying, or barbecuing, it forms compounds called heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are the same types of compounds that form when tobacco is burned, and they are directly carcinogenic in animal studies. So a piece of grass-fed organic steak that is cooked rare is a very different thing from a well-done hamburger that has been charred on a grill until it is black on the outside. The charring is where the problem is. One study published in Cancer Research found that people who preferred their meat very well done had more than 3 times the risk of certain cancers compared to those who preferred it rare or medium. So the takeaway here is not that you need to cut out red meat entirely. The evidence does not support that for most people, but it does suggest that you should be mindful of 3 things: how much processed meat you eat, how often you eat it, and how you cook your fresh meat. Lower temperatures, shorter cooking times, and marinating meat before cooking can significantly reduce the formation of these harmful compounds. A simple marinade with olive oil, lemon juice, and herbs can cut heterocyclic amine formation by over 90% in some studies. That is a surprisingly effective intervention for something that takes almost no extra effort. Part 4. There is another category of everyday foods that deserves attention, and it is one that most people do not think about at all. Deep-fried foods and foods cooked at very high temperatures for long periods. When starchy foods like potatoes or bread are cooked at high temperatures, they form a compound called acrylamide. Acrylamide is classified as a probable human carcinogen, and it forms through a chemical reaction between sugars and an amino acid called asparagine when temperatures exceed about 120 degrees Celsius. This is the browning you see on French fries, potato chips, toast that is a bit too dark, and crispy roasted potatoes. The darker the browning, the more acrylamide is formed. Now, the amounts of acrylamide in food are generally low, and the evidence for cancer risk at dietary levels is still being studied. But the European Food Safety Authority has concluded that dietary exposure to acrylamide is a concern because it has been shown to cause cancer in animal studies. And the same principle applies here that applies to everything else in this video. If you are eating these foods every day, the exposure accumulates. A bag of chips here, some dark toast there, a portion of fries with lunch, it adds up. The easy fix here is simple. Cook starchy foods until they are golden, not brown. Avoid charring or burning any food. And when it comes to deep-fried foods, the issue is not just acrylamide. Deep frying also creates advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, which are compounds that drive inflammation and oxidative stress throughout the body. And as we covered earlier, chronic inflammation is one of the key conditions that cancer cells need to thrive. So foods that are deep-fried are essentially delivering a triple hit. They spike your blood sugar, they create inflammatory compounds, and they often contain unhealthy fats that further promote inflammation. What makes this difficult is that these foods are everywhere, and they are marketed as normal. A side of fries is standard with almost any meal out. Potato chips are the default snack. But once you understand what is happening inside your body when you eat them regularly, it becomes much easier to choose something else. Part 5. There is one more everyday food category I want to cover, and it is probably the most surprising one. Refined grains and ultra-processed carbohydrate foods. Things like white bread, white rice, pasta made from refined flour, breakfast cereals, crackers, and most packaged snack foods. And the reason these matter is not because there is something inherently toxic about a grain of wheat. It is because of what happens to your blood sugar and insulin when you eat them without the accompanying fiber, protein, or fat that would normally slow down digestion. Refined grains have been stripped of their fiber and most of their nutrients during processing. What is left is a rapidly digestible starch that hits your bloodstream almost as fast as sugar. And that spike in blood sugar triggers a spike in insulin, which drives up IGF-1 levels, which we already know is a growth signal for cancer cells. But there is another layer to this that is less well known. The gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in your digestive tract, play a major role in cancer risk. And the food you eat either feeds the beneficial bacteria or it feeds the harmful ones. Fiber from whole foods like vegetables, legumes, and whole grains is the preferred fuel for beneficial gut bacteria. When these bacteria digest fiber, they produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which has been shown to protect against colorectal cancer by supporting the health of the cells lining the colon and by reducing inflammation. But when you eat a diet high in refined grains and low in fiber, you are essentially starving your beneficial bacteria while feeding the less helpful ones. And that shift in the gut microbiome, called dysbiosis, has been linked to increased inflammation, weakened immune function, and a higher risk of several cancers. A study published in the journal Nature in 2024 found that people with a more diverse and fiber-fermenting gut microbiome had significantly lower levels of inflammatory markers and a lower incidence of colorectal cancer. So the problem with refined grains is not just the blood sugar spike. It is also that every time you choose white bread over whole grain bread, or sugary cereal over oats, or white rice over brown rice, you are missing an opportunity to feed the bacteria that are protecting you. Part 6. Now here is where I want to bring all of this together into something you can actually use. Because information without action is just noise, and I know you did not watch this video to be scared. You watched it to know what to do. So here is the practical framework. First, if you drink sugar-sweetened beverages, including fruit juice, swap them for water, unsweetened tea, or coffee. This single change has the largest impact on your metabolic health of any dietary change you can make, and the research backs that up consistently. Second, when it comes to meat, think about frequency and method. Processed meats like bacon and sausage are fine as an occasional treat, but not as a daily staple. Fresh red meat is fine in reasonable portions, especially if you cook it gently. Avoid charring or blackening. Marinate before grilling. And consider having a few meat-free days each week where you focus on plant proteins like beans, lentils, and tofu. Third, cook starchy foods until they are golden, not brown. If your toast or fries look dark, they have more acrylamide. Aim for a light golden color, and you are in a much better place. Fourth, shift your carbohydrate sources from refined to whole. Swap white bread for whole grain. Swap sugary cereal for oatmeal. Swap white rice for brown rice or quinoa. And aim to get at least 25 to 30 grams of fiber per day from whole food sources. That is roughly 3 to 4 servings of vegetables, plus some legumes and whole grains. And fifth, and this is important, do not try to do all of these at once. Pick one. The beverage swap is usually the easiest and has the biggest impact. Do that for 2 weeks. Then add another one. Small, consistent changes compound over time, and that is exactly how you create an internal environment that makes it much harder for cancer cells to take hold and thrive. The goal is not perfection. The goal is direction, and every single meal is an opportunity to move in the right direction. Part 7. I want to leave you with one final thought. The reason this topic matters so much is not because every meal is a matter of life and death. It is not. You can have a soda, you can have bacon, you can have fries. The occasional indulgence is not what drives disease. What drives disease is the pattern. The everyday choices that become habits, that become the default way you eat without even thinking about it. And the research is clear that shifting those patterns, even modestly, has a meaningful impact on cancer risk. Not a theoretical impact, a measured, documented, replicated impact across dozens of large-scale studies involving hundreds of thousands of people. The body wants to be healthy. It has remarkable systems for repair and defense. But those systems need the right raw materials to work. And every time you choose a whole food over a processed one, a vegetable over a refined starch, or water over a sugary drink, you are giving your body exactly what it needs to protect itself. That is not a small thing. That is a powerful thing. And it is something you can act on starting with your next meal. One more point before you go. All of the food-related work we have covered is amplified by 2 other factors that deserve equal attention: quality sleep and stress management. When you are chronically sleep-deprived or under sustained stress, your body produces more cortisol, a hormone that directly drives inflammation and worsens insulin resistance. And those are the exact conditions we have been talking about throughout this video. The food choices matter enormously, and they are your primary lever. But they work best when they are supported by good sleep habits and a reasonable approach to managing daily stress. They are all connected. Think of it as a 3-legged stool: diet, sleep, and stress management. Each one supports the others. Stay consistent, and we will see you in the next one.